I'm going to chair this session, which is on European higher education and UK higher education, the future. My name's Ellen Hazelkorn. I'm a member of the Management Committee and the Advisory Board, and also one of the co-investigators for CGHE. I will make a few comments and I'll introduce the panel, and then each of the panel are going to make some comments initially, and then we're going to open up for a dialogue and a discussion. So, coming just weeks before the famous triggering of Article 50 for Brexit, and weeks after the inauguration of Donald Trump, this panel discussion is going to explore some of the drivers and effects of changing global and local relations in education and knowledge with and between nations, including looking at some of the global-local synergies and tensions. Higher education is closely affected by current political, economic, and cultural debates. We've seen that certainly in the discussion we've just had, the paper by Jenny, and certainly more generally. Some of the issues are global in nature. Other issues are felt at a national level but play out in nearly all countries. And another group of issues play out nationally or regionally but not everywhere. So this discussion is really less about the particularities of the UK. It's not a catharsis about the UK, but more of a wider discussion about the possible implications of Brexit for Europe, for the UK and the world, and more generally for higher education. I think Simon touched on some of these issues in his intro, and I'm going to refer to some of them in my very, very brief comments. So in the UK, we've had varying variety of headlines and commentary that go from the apocalyptic to the confidently optimistic. For those outside the UK, and I look at this issue in my role as a policy advisor to the Higher Education Authority, which is the government agency, and other people which I talk to, we are, I have to confess, left scratching our heads as to what's happening. But there are also much wider questions about emergent social political forces, the changing shape of the world order, and the geopolitics of higher education. And these latter questions certainly interest me on a research level. So just three very brief comments. The role of the EU as both a regional economic as well as a social cultural entity, and a political project, mission, and vision. I come from the States. I understand federalism well. I understand the battle over states' rights. This is where, Trump is driving. I understand it. I come from Illinois. It was Obama country. It still is. The origins of the EU in the post-World War II period, as well as the importance of Bologna, the European higher education area, the European research area, have been important and really powerful instruments for European higher education and research. Of course, there are inequalities. There are all kinds of issues about the distribution of wealth and mobility, and we look at the distribution of research funds and concentration, but the interdependence between states and member states and the importance of it is there to be seen and to witness. This was all allowed to be forgotten as politicians, and indeed many others, have sought to blame the EU for their own failings. And interestingly enough, it's an interesting case of how we allow political discourse, or how political discourse, even in throwaways, shapes public sentiment and opinion with sometimes very chilling effects. And we see that very clearly in the US as well. Then there is the issue of the changing world order, the shift from the British, American, Asian century, this whole issue, the strength of nativist and nationalist rhetoric in reaction to what Gallagher and Garrett refer to as the third phase of internationalization, the growing shift in economic power and activity at a time when many OECD countries are battling for talent against the sharp demographic changes. Witness the choices that have been made in Germany and in Scandinavia. And isn't it ironic that at precisely this moment, when countries are increasingly more dependent on internationalization, the international cultural experience, as well as the people themselves of the US and UK are shutting their doors. Just that moment when others are recognizing the value of collaboration, what I call on a higher education level, maximizing capacity beyond individual capability. And then my phrase of mind the gap. The extent to which the Brexit vote is shaped by socioeconomic, education, geographical factors. US vote, similar in some regards, looking at the maps, which I find really quite dramatic. But one way, and Simon did refer to this, the way in which university towns voted quite distinctly. The Chronicle of Higher Education has done a really interesting tracking of this and looking at where public universities are and the votes in the rest of the state. And so in the aftermath of all this, the attention being given to the role of higher education, the discussions this morning, the gulf opening up between the pursuit of global recognition and preference for engagement with social societal challenges and impact, and the whole issue we have not just about teaching and learning and access and wider participation, but the role of an anchor institution in the region. So going beyond just that. For people in developed and OECD countries, there was this underlying belief that one would be better off, that progress was a birthright, and so on. And certainly this view from the developed world that other parts of the world are doing better has spurred a real sense of concern and grievance. And so another way to frame the questions that Jenny looked at is whether or not the social contract is in trouble. So we want to look at some of these sets of issues. The panelists have all been asked to look at this, and to start with maybe a 3-minute statement addressing the broad question of the likely effects for European higher education as it operates in an increasingly more contentious geopolitical environment, with some countries and institutions taking up the gauntlet of nationalism and regionalism, and then looking at a wide range of issues that spur from that, including the issues of the growing expansion, where does this leave, the effects of higher education, the role, the implications on relationships that are there, and so on. And we have a terrific panel that is going to bring a really wide European and international perspective to take us beyond the immediacy. So, and we're going to run in this order then as well. So we're going to start with Anne Corbett, who's well known to many of you here, Senior Associate at LSE, who looks and has published extensively on the whole issue of Europe. Christine Musselin, who's a sociologist, Vice President of Research at CNSAPO, who is in charge of the Higher Education and Research Group and has long written on issues of European higher education and beyond. And finally, Pedro Teixeira, who's the Vice Rector of the University of Porto, involved heavily with SHARE, and advisor to the President of Portugal. So I think with this, we're going to have a really fantastic discussion. I'm going to start with Anne.
And this works. Does it work?
Yes,
good.
That's fine.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I note the word catharsis is not to be used. So I do present myself as an academic and as a political scientist, which has a relevance for what I'm about to say. But I should just add that in the connection of what has been happening, Brexit and Britain, I was the rapporteur for the LSE Commission on Brexit with the strand concerning higher education and research, which has meant that I've followed it all rather closely, though, as Ellen indicated, really my first love and my ongoing love is European-wide higher education. So actually you say, what are the likely effects? So I say, in a political scientist way, that's not a question I'm going to answer. I think we ought to be talking about the parameters of uncertainty, and that actually has something which sort of offers us hope in that it suggests that things are quite open. And I think that the immediate, the question that really does underline what we're facing, looking at this question in a European way, it should take us back to the basic questions of politics and who wins, which groups have made the better connection, I would say, between ideas, institutions, and the political will to drive change. And we've sat back in higher education for quite a long time, I think, feeling secure and facing many of the changes we've talked about. Is it not working?
It's working, yes. Move it to the center.
Okay. And so Brexit, which I regard as a case study rather than something to be gone into directly, was a shock in that it did show, and this was a lot to do with the way the British electoral system works, how very strong people who thought first in national terms are. I mean, it was 25% of the vote who, in Britain, just like in France, in the Netherlands, are saying the next. And I think that the drama, therefore, for higher education, somebody raised the question earlier, is that it has been exposed as being on the losing side of a fracture line in society. And it is the fact that it's all the more shocking for higher education as a sector, as institutions, in that those who are disavowed by the result in Britain are primarily the young and the highly educated. And of course the fact that a lot of the young did not vote, although they would have voted, they say Remain, they're certainly showing their anxieties now. So what I think that it's important to realize in looking towards any sort of solutions that might come out of this is to realize if we adopt that sort of triad of ideas, institutions, and political legitimacy, that the idea of a more nationalist view of control of society has been fermenting over the years, but our political institutions haven't really allowed that voice to come to the surface, certainly not in Britain. And that for and that it may only be 25% who have such very hardline views. But the particular drama that we're faced with now is that we have a political choice, at least in Britain, which is a political choice which didn't necessarily have to be made. It was one that needed to respect the vote to leave, but it didn't have to be a form of Brexit, which will ensure that we're out of all the institutions. So I just want to say very quickly, I have 1 minute, that can there be a higher education and associated fight back, and what are the ideas and institutions it should mobilize? I would say here that there ought, in rational terms, to be a chance that this could be Europe's moment. It could be the solidarity throughout the European arena of higher education which now exists. Because there is an arena which has been committed for two things that Europe has done well. One is to make mobility something which has an organized mobility, which has a structure behind it. And we know it, of course, with Erasmus. And the other thing has been what Europe has wanted right since the 1950s, to have an effective research dimension. And Europe has provided that infrastructure. So really, the question now is, can that be mobilized? But to think that, we're needing to think Europe first, what are the links, and then apply that back to Britain.
Okay, thanks, Anne.
Christine?
Thank you very much. It's a very difficult task. I know we are recorded, and I hope I will not have to look at that in a few years and say, oh God, we were completely wrong, because it's so uncertain right now to know what will happen, what the Brexit will bring to higher education, that it's very difficult really to say something and be sure about it. But let's try. There are 2 points I would like to start with. The first one is that I'm not sure that more solidarity will happen in Europe. And I think that the Brexit arrived probably at the worst moment for Europe, when Europe was already very fragile after the Greek crisis and the 2008 crisis in general. So that I'm not sure that if there were a referendum like in the UK, in other parts of Europe, we won't have a complete dissolution of the European sphere. And so I very much hope that nobody would do that in another country for the moment. And I think that that's part of the problem, which is that Europe is blamed in so many countries. When I say Europe, I mean European Commission, Brussels, whatever you want, but there is a very bad spirit, a bad evaluation of the European scene, and that's something we have to take on board when we are thinking about what can happen now. And in a way, I completely agree with Anne with the fact that mobility, the research framework programs, and the Bologna process, even if it's not a European one, it's an intergovernmental process. I keep on that. But they brought many positive things, but at the same time, I think that we really failed in constructing the European higher education area. If we compare it to the US, and I think it's a very nice comparison to do, we don't have a unified academic labor market in Europe. We don't have it. We don't have it either for students. We don't have a European market for students as there is in the US, even if I agree it's a curious market, it's not running exactly like a market, but nevertheless, students are moving from one state to another. There are clear rules about that. It's not the case in Europe, even with the Bologna process. And when I look at the recent reforms in so many European countries, what do I see? I see European countries competing one against another. When Germany is leading the Excellence Initiative, when France is doing the so-called Grand Emprunt, which is the French Excellence Initiative, and so on, what are they doing? They are trying to get the best position in the world and not really looking at what is going on in the other countries. So I think that many things very positive happen at the European level, but at the same time, we still are in a very competitive situation. And it's something which is very classical, I would say, in terms of a sociologist explanation and the kind of things we are looking at when you're a sociologist. So that we have, on the one hand, cooperation, but at the same time, competition, and how do they work one with another, one against another. But from my point of view, I'm not sure there will be much solidarity among the European countries after the Brexit in terms of higher education, and I'm not sure that it's going in a very positive way from this point of view. A second point, very briefly, about that I would like to put on the table in order to start the discussion, is the kind of reflection we should have at the level of our institutions. I very much agree with the remark of Jürgen Enders just before. I think we can apply it to our European universities. How did we come to this situation? That's very curious and I'm really perplexed about that. In the 19th century, we all know that universities very much contributed to the creation of nation states, and that they were very oriented towards the development of a national identity for the people they trained. So, okay, then you expect people to be very nationalist, very protectionist, because of this development of higher education. We are no more in this situation. We have a lot, and that's wonderful, we have a lot of international students. When we teach our own authors, but we also teach what others in other countries have done. So universities have really become international, but nevertheless, we were not able to change the national mind, and we were not able to prevent this development of nationalist, very nationalist positions, even from trained people. We always think that it's only the people from lower backgrounds who are thinking like that, but it's not true. If I look at the people voting for Marine Le Pen in France, they are not only blue-collar workers, you know, and desesperated by the crisis. So why did we get there? There is a strong contradiction, I think, between what we tried to do and what we, in fact, did. And so I think there is a big reflection to lead in our own institution in order to better understand why we came here.
Thank you. And I'm very grateful for the invitation. And well, I was tempted to start with the old Monty Python phrase, and now for something completely different, uncertainty, because that was the first issue I wanted to raise. And I think really the problem with uncertainty and trying to paraphrase some of the wonderful, interesting and first session this morning into the use of economics in higher education is that I hope it will not be bad economics, but one of the things that we know from economics and from market economics is that in a context of high uncertainty, agents tend to be risk averse, and they tend to not to engage in collaboration and in exchange, because the fact that they don't know a lot about the other partners and about the whole situation means that they will refrain from engaging in exchanges in can be monetary exchanges, but non-monetary exchanges. So I think one of the issues that I think it's very difficult at the moment in the relationship between UK institutions and European institutions of higher education and science is the fact that we don't know what will happen. And the fact that this uncertainty is dragging for a long time and is likely to continue for a long time, I think is a problem. And I think this is further complicated by a lack of discussion, I would say, in most European countries. I suspect it's not the case in the UK, but it's certainly, I would say, in at least the countries that I'm more familiar with, there's more discussion in the public at large than in higher education about the impacts of Brexit. So I think that also says something about what Christine just said, about our social disengagement of the university as a sort of as a political institution. I think part of that has to do with a certain degree of perplexity in a lot of higher education and research networks. I think we didn't see it coming, and I think we still, we start this session with the word catharsis, so I think it also says something about the paralysis that I think exists, the intellectual paralysis that we're facing. And having said that, although I think we're invited to say something more than this, I think we face different potential scenarios, which I would say, raise from a scenario where not much will change for education and science because the public at large, policymakers think that it's very important, despite the weaknesses that Christine pointed out in terms of the higher education and the European higher education and the European research areas. That would be a scenario. I don't know how likely that scenario is, but if that's a desirable scenario for both the UK and European higher education institutions, then we would need to start working on how to make that scenario more likely, and I don't think we're working on that. And then there is the other extreme scenario where there is a significant shift in terms of the context in which we've been operating. And again, if that happens, how we'll respond to that and how we'll prepare for that. And I would say that most likely because this is a political process and this is a European process, and as you know, European processes tend to be driven towards compromises. We'll have a sort of intermediate scenario where, for instance, there will be possibility to continue with certain types of agreements where UK institutions will be eligible, for instance, for European Research Council funding, but probably not to the next framework program and for structural funding. And that will mean different things for different types of institutions, both in the UK and in Europe. And I think, again, we should draw consequences from that. I will not elaborate at this stage more on this, but I think that that's an important issue. The other issue that I think is worthwhile raising is that, to a certain extent, we're facing the consequences of having for a long time sustained what I would say a biased or superficial narrative about European integration in higher education and science. I mean, some of us have been discussing this for some time, and we knew, I think for a long time, we tend to overemphasize the drivers towards more integration, and we play down the obstacles and the tensions associated with that integration. And I think in many ways, part of the difficulty now to grasp the process is that we need to readjust this narrative and the fact that, well, I mean, Christine already pointed out the academic labor market, the students. We could talk about social security. We talk about student support schemes. A lot of these still stayed very much nationally embedded, and we pretended that this wouldn't be an obstacle and wouldn't be a problem in terms of European integration. And that wouldn't have an impact in terms of the mobility of staff, which is still much lower than the mobility of students, and so on and so forth. So I think part of the problem that we need, and this I think it's quite an appropriate occasion or event for this, is to how we can rebalance the discussion and pay more attention to the tensions within the European integration in research and in higher education. And I would probably emphasize it even more in terms of research, because it's been driven, I think, a lot of these European developments and the impact it has in systems, the differentiated impact it has in higher education systems, in institutions and in disciplines. And that's the final comment I will make at this stage, is that I know that I've been warned by a careful sociologist that we shouldn't make bold predictions. But you know that economists tend to be not very wise, as we've been. My hypothesis would be that this will have a very differentiated impact across systems, across institutions, and across disciplines. And this links to what I was saying in terms of the differentiated views about the European integration. I think for some institutions, they will not face significant change because they continue to be attractive, interested in intellectual engagement, and they are part in many ways of this elite that I think Christine was also alluding to, that have these very strong ties, both through research and also through joint programs. But in fact, I mean, for many institutions, I would dare to say even many institutions in the EU and in the UK, it will probably not make a huge difference, the fact that they become, again, more locally or national oriented. I think this may come as a bit of uneasiness for many of us, but I think that will not be a big change. I think it will be also interesting to explore what will be the impact in terms of disciplines. Just a quick comment. I was looking at, for instance, at the results of ERC grants, the starting, consolidating, and advanced grants. And it's interesting because in almost all of them, social science and humanities have a higher proportion of success vis-à-vis in terms of the UK submissions than life sciences and what's the other one that I'm missing? So it's life science, engineering, I think.
Probably.
Yeah. And that I think is actually quite interesting, because I think one of the part of the challenge here is that I think we're talking about an audience that is mainly dominated by people from social science and humanities. And I think it's probably the area where I would say the impact will be more significant in terms of the relationship. And I'll stop.
Okay, might ask you to just reflect for a moment on what these changes, because it's quite an interesting reflecting on changes within Europe. And then there are some other dynamics, that is the shift, the changing dynamics between Europe and the rest of the world. And how, to what extent are these changes and the effect of Brexit changing the relationship or opening up different relationships between Europe and the rest of the world at a time in which you see arguably increasing optimism and expansion elsewhere, particularly in Asia?
Well, of course, the point seen from a UK perspective is that there has been a discourse that Britain could go it alone, and this all reflects the top 10 situations, the top universities in the top 10, the success in attracting international students and EU students, all of which of course is up for question depending on the form of Brexit we have. But I think it's this particular view that because there are outstanding universities on global rankings in Britain, that is good enough to ensure the status of the nation in its higher education. It's a ridiculous assertion on two grounds. One, that many of the achievements, of course, of these universities is as a result of collaboration. Europe has become the science hub of the world because its research has been, so much of it's been collaborative, and that's the highly cited research, which is actually rather better than the States. But the other point in saying that there is a kind of vision where you ignore your geographical and your historical context is that the institutions that we have at the moment at a European level, which have been supportive, maybe not as much as you would have wished, but nevertheless are there, these are extremely difficult to replicate. They're very difficult to replicate at a research level. And I would just put in a plea for them being, and say that they're difficult to replicate at the level where Europe might, a European discussions could be of most help at the moment if each of these countries, European countries, are facing problems of public legitimacy of universities, of concern about their vulnerability. The big wake-up call for Brexit and elsewhere is that there are so many universities in the country which have not been able to project their public role, which have not been able to engage locally. I think this is the absolute drama when you have 50% of an age group in university and you're not thinking about the margins, about them or the groups who are not getting higher education. Immediately, should universities be doing more in their local area? Maybe they are doing already, but we don't know about it. Are they thinking more flexibly about how to engage with the local educational context? I think these are questions which are absolutely common across Europe, and one does better to think about those than necessarily only about trade.
I'm not sure that the Brexit will have any influence on the relationships between Europe and other parts of the world. I think that the situation was already quite challenging before the Brexit. And Europe, despite what I said before, that we have not been as far as we maybe could have gone in terms of constructing a European higher education area. Europe is nevertheless probably the more advanced regional collaboration in the world, with maybe the exception of the American states, but I think that's something, that's another issue. So I think that from this point of view, and even without UK, I'm sorry to say that, the continental Europe will probably go on its rhythm, and the gap, the reduced gap between Europe and other parts of the world, that will go on. I think that it won't affect very much the development. So I think the development, the dynamics were already there. And we all know about the extraordinary dynamics in Asia, for instance. And it will go on. It was there before. And I don't see how the Brexit could affect that. Maybe one way to have, one thing that may happen would be that Asian countries would become more aware that they have to speed up their collaborations in order to really become a regional opponents or competitors with Europe. That might be a consequence, but I don't see it really something that will change because of the Brexit. The Brexit, from my point of view, is much more affecting European countries than the relationships we have with other parts of the world, but I may be wrong.
So Europe as an economic region, because the whole development of world regions is becoming increasingly stronger at a point when we find two others floating free, so to speak. Pedro.
I'm actually quite skeptical about this shift of alliances and networks. I think actually this is, you could even draw a parallel, I mean, maybe I'll be wrong, but I think like in other areas of the renegotiation, like trade, I think reality will show that it actually will be more difficult to replace the existing ones by new ones. And I really, when it comes specifically to higher education and science, I have difficulty in seeing why it will be more straightforward to develop deeper collaboration with distant partners than it was at the moment with European partners. So I'm a bit skeptical, but maybe it's my bias as a sort of pro-European. I think is also certainly influencing on this. And I think although I agree with Christine that life will go on, certainly in terms of continental Europe, but it will have an impact. I think when you look at data on the 7th Framework Programme or the Horizon 2020, the UK comes consistently either number 2 or number 1 in terms of the major partner of collaboration with all the other EU countries. And this is something that has been built over years and will not be easily replaced. A few guesses, I think this probably will reinforce the centrality of Germany as the leading partner, which was already. I was actually sharing with Ellen. It's still preliminary, but whereas in 7th Framework Programme for Ireland, number 1 was the UK and number 2 was Germany. For Horizon 2020 up to now, the biggest collaboration is already with Germany, and the second place is the UK. Well, we're only looking at half of the process, but I would suspect that the second half will even further reinforce this. So I think that I think will produce a shift. It's actually also quite interesting when you look at the top 5 countries with which each country collaborates. They're always dominated by 5+1 countries. So it's always the big 5. So it's Germany, the UK, France, Italy, and Spain. And then very often the Netherlands, which, as you know, always pulls above its weight. Isn't it, Marike? Which always has a very strong international presence. But and I think that probably will reinforce the centrality of the other ones.
Or Ireland as an English-speaking.
Yeah, we need to keep Ireland to have a sort of official language. The other thing that I think will be interesting is to see how different types of countries in Europe will respond to this. Because I think the big countries can afford to become more inward-looking in some ways. The smaller countries, I think, will have much more difficulty in dealing with this because they are much more dependent on networks and they cannot afford anymore. And furthermore, I think there will be a tension there, not only, of course, in these countries, but even more in smaller or more peripheral countries, in terms of the disciplinary loyalties and the instrumental dimension of the European Union. So the fact, I think it will vary a lot in terms of how central UK research and education institutions are in each discipline, how consolidated are organizational networks, what is the pool of major publications in certain fields in order to sustain those networks, whereas in other areas I think will be more complicated. And again, I would say that in most social science and humanities, because they tend to be much more national embedded in terms of their research agenda, probably with the exception of economics, which is always the odd one in social science, if you still want to consider economics a social science. And I think, but in most of that, I think the tension there will be more towards a certain localism. Some of the reversal towards English as a main language in terms of science, I think that may also occur in certain corners.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm going to throw this open. We've covered quite a lot of issues that I wanted to discuss with the panel, issues around legitimacy that comes up, the role of higher education, the issue of the changing landscape of within European higher education and within nations, issues around mobility, not just of academics, but of students, and greater issues on that sort. I guess I'm then interested in the changing, as I said, the geopolitics of higher education and how that's playing out. But I think at this stage, let's open it to the floor. Let's take a couple of questions and comments. If you could keep them short so we can come back to the panel, and if you could just introduce yourself initially. So I see Marek and Thomas over here. And
Thank you. I'm Marek van der Wende from the Netherlands. On the European scene, I think we should also include Switzerland. I'm looking in my research at 3 countries that stand out in terms of performance, globally, and in terms of their international openness. And those are Switzerland, the UK, and the Netherlands, on all measures. And my neighbor here, Futao Han, just confirmed in his research how high the percentage of international PhDs and faculty is in the Netherlands, indeed. But that goes for the 3. In 2014, Switzerland voted in a referendum against the free mobility of people and got into trouble on EU funding for research and participation in Erasmus. That was the first. Then UK Brexit 2016. We have elections in 2 weeks' time, and some of the very prominent right-wing parties, but not only right-wing, are seeking a quorum for an exit referendum. So we're a little nervous. But it's not only, and I appreciate the comments here, it's not only from outside the universities. I hear in Parliament motions on Dutch students first. I hear in the university voices against teaching in English. I hear in the university and around the university voices on internationalization being an elite cosmopolitan project. I'm not saying this is a majority voice, not at all, but it's there. It's open, it's public, and sometimes a little loud even. I hear speculations on the scenario, if Brexit is hard, more EU students would come to the Netherlands. And, you know, people may be naive there again. This word is very relevant and say, oh, that's very good. But is it for a small country to have more than 2 universities full of, you know, neighboring countries' students on taxpayers' costs? Wouldn't that actually fuel an exit? Seriously. I mean, we're not sure where we're going at all. And these are not the positive scenarios I was just pointing to, but back to Simon's introduction. I mean, we seriously, as universities, have to think about inclusiveness, about how we're being perceived on, you know, running for global prestige and, well, you know, criticized on local delivery. And I think for internationalization in particular, can we make it more inclusive? I don't think we've succeeded to make it more inclusive, or probably inclusive at all, or enough so far. Well, I'm not sure this is more cheerful than presentations before, but this is where we are. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Thomas, and then Barbara Peer.
Thomas Jorgensen from the European University Association. So I'm fresh in from Brussels. Lots of comments. I'll just make one. I mean, we're, of course, as an association, working on Brexit in terms of lobbying, and it's getting extremely technical, but also in the long-term consequences of nationalism. And one of the things, when you think about it, and also when you look at sort of the distangling of EU research collaboration, is how the multilateral paradigm that we have lived through, at least during the last 2-3 decades, has been extremely good for universities because it facilitates internationalism, it facilitates collaboration. Even the free trade consensus that we have with the WTO and the rest of it is good for universities because it forces nation states to compete by upskilling their labor force, which a nationalist or bilateral relations will not necessarily do. There you can protect your coal miners. So we've been in a basically taken a historical situation for granted, which is now at least threatened. And I think that's an interesting, scary, long time.
Thanks very much. Can I have the mic down here? I know there's a lot of people coming in. I'm going to take a few more comments and then come back to the panel, and then we'll go one more time.
Okay, thank you very much. Barbara Keane, University of Glasgow. I'd like also to make a comment. I think I mean, Britain was never that much of a proponent of the European integration in higher education in terms of a more unified and integrated system. I think basically Britain thought about the Bologna process that the rest of Europe would become like them, which actually led to the fact that there is a continental European mainstream of implementing Bologna and a special case of the UK. That is one issue. Mobility. The line is flat. There is around 1 or 2% of British students going, on study-related periods abroad, whereas, for instance, take a country like Germany, it's 30%. And basically, another issue that I would like to make here, another point I would like to make is working at a Scottish university, you can be sure that once the Brexit is officially opened, which will probably happen in the spring sometime, later spring, there will relatively soon, there will be another independent referendum for Scotland, and that will have another outcome as the previous one. So that will cut off a part of the UK, and which is kind of worrying in itself, But I don't know whether, for instance, Northern Ireland will follow, who is also much more pro-European than Britain itself, like the Scottish. And at the same time, people, who are supporting stronger European integration cannot see and watch this process going on, that Europe is kind of splitting up into, hundreds of little banana republics, if you want. We have problems with Belgium, we have separatist movements in Spain, and so on and so on. So the idea, I think, with all this, we also need to discuss maybe a new concept of federalism, of federalism that can and might work out. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. Let me just come back to the panel and then go out again. Any comments, responses? Pedro?
2 quick comments. One is that I think you shouldn't expect a lot of altruism on the side of European institutions. I think those that will continue to engage and will be willing to engage is because, as you hinted, Marek, is that they expect to benefit in some way. And part of the problem is that I think some of these will become, if we don't do anything, if we stay in this sort of paralysis, in many ways a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's anecdotal evidence, but what I've seen, for instance, in my own institution is that if we are reapplying for joint European programs that were coordinated by a British university, the new proposal will not be coordinated by a British university, and there will be another university just in case we have a minimum number of universities if the British will not be counted after 2018 or 19, whatever. So, or examples of applications for research networks that were initially planned to be submitted by a British university, but in fact were submitted by a continental European university, which involve actually American universities, several elite ones, because they felt that this could damage the proposal. And I think that because, as you said, that the UK in many ways was a follower of the process, was not a proponent, but it was a very advantageous follow. I mean, if you look at ERC, if you look at the framework programs, the UK always got a very, very significant share of that. So British universities had a reputation of being very good in terms of coordinating research proposals, of being successful at that, and that made them take a very prominent role. And that I think, will suffer tremendously in that respect. So I think that's one issue that you need to think about. And that's where the realignment, I think, is already occurring because of the uncertainty. The last comment I would make is in terms of, I mean, several of things that we've been saying in this, I think also, and I don't want to put too much emphasis on the sort of self-inflicted punishment that we are facing in the session about the failures of public universities, or the university as a public institution, and also as a political institution. And the fear that I have is that it's not only that we disengage from public debates, and this will become a political debate in many ways, but also if we have the qualified people in our academia to engage in this kind of debate. Due to the type of criteria that we've been using again and again in promotion and recruitment, which in many ways were geared towards, I would say, a very much individualistic, self-interested research agenda, where engagement with society was normally not particularly regarded as a sort of major criteria in terms of promotion. And of course, I'm simplifying and generalizing. I wonder if we will have qualified actors in many universities to engage in society in terms of this discussion.
You raise a couple of important questions there about the role of higher education going beyond. I know there's a lot of chat about widening access, participation, all those issues, but beyond that, what is the role And I'm interested then in one of the slides I think that Jenny had about whether or not higher education is being, quote, asked to do things which isn't its responsibility. But then one needs to ask, well, what is that? And are there a whole range of questions? I'm interested then in Mareik's point about internationalization seen as an elite project, because at the end of the day, there's only a small number of students who will ever travel. So how do you internationalize the campus, but not just your campus, the community in which you're living? And that's really the bigger set to the other side of the state or the county. What's the value of that experience that spills over? So did you want to come in on this? I'll open this up again to the floor. Yeah, sorry, wait for the mic.
I'm Vasiliki Papatsiba from the University of Sheffield. I'd like to add the academic labour market lens to what we're discussing here. Although it's more narrow, it is significant nevertheless. We know, for example, that in the last decade in England, 40% of all academic appointments were made to other than UK, EU academics. So from other European countries than England, 40%. So nearly 1 in 2. We also know that currently the percentage, there are approximately 17% of European, non-UK European academics working in England. And we also know that these academics do gain approximately 50% of the ERC grants. So it is an important part of the English academic workforce. We do not know how they will behave in this climate of uncertainty, whether they will continue to feel welcomed in this country, and whether the ones who are already here will decide to remain, or they will decide that they have enough academic capital to go elsewhere, because collaborations are going to be affected, but also there is that sense of belonging and something which is more around identities that we do not often discuss because these are more normative sort of dimensions. So your perceptions and scenarios on that point.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Carl Allen. Mine are 2 comments really, not questions. From what has been said through the morning, I would say we are talking about not higher education in the sense of it being higher, but it simply being more. And I say more education in the context that we have no common degree content across all universities when we are talking in the context of the UK and the EU, and common in the sense that you leave university, but you have no common political or economic or social or even environmental or legal background. The graduates don't share that commonality. So we are simply talking about more education rather than higher education. And that is the cause of many a problem.
Thank you. Anyone else? Right, I'll come back to the panel. Anne?
I'd like to comment on 2 points. Have I found them? I mean, I think it's been quite interesting that we've operated at 2 levels, talking of long term, there might not be all that much change, and then what's the short-term change, and it might be these catastrophe scenarios, which are certainly possible in Britain, of British researchers being cut out of projects. There are lots of rumours of this. We haven't actually had much evidence. If you've got it, send it quickly to Universities UK. But and of course whether students will decide in Fee High Britain whether it is still worth coming. There's been so much about xenophobic behaviour, which we don't know how much it is, but it's definitely been a factor in perceptions. And then how can one get past that catastrophe scenario? I think in the end it really does depend so much on the British government and the attitude that it's going to take. You saw that a former Prime Minister said yesterday it would be a very good thing to have a little bit more charm injected and rather less cheap rhetoric, because in the end one's negotiating with 27 other countries. And how actually do you start in a constructive atmosphere? And I've looked at the development of European higher education over the sort of 5 decades. And what's very interesting is that in the end you do get to where you want to get in terms of a consensus and working together. You have sorted it out. But there's an awful lot of sort of roadblocks on the way. And, you know, we're at such a dividing point at this moment in the next few months, in these 2 years. And the time for people to decide that Britain's not the place to be, that it is critically worrying. And that's why I said earlier that I think that there needs to be a lot of European understanding of what the situation is, so that there is, that it's not all dog eats dog. There is a kind of solidarity. There's a solidarity about democratic values. There's a solidarity about what higher education is for. And I think those are the things that it would be a help to the British if people would, if this discourse was coming from elsewhere. Thank you.
Yes, I agree that that would be great and needed, but I'm not sure that's exactly what happens, and I cannot answer your questions, Vasiliki, because that will depend on the people living in the UK, and you're more able than me to answer this question. But what I see in my own country is, in fact, 2 kinds of reactions. One which is great, we will get the pot now, so that's something, and you maybe listened about or heard about some institutions trying to get cooperations with UK institutions in order to attract them to France, and that's one part of the game, and it's about institutions and individuals, and it's really linked to what you said about the fact that universities in a way were transformed into economic competitors. Academics are also trained and encouraged to be very individualistic and global rather than national or even institutional. So it has an impact on the behaviors of people, and that's one part. On the other, I must say that in France too there is this notion of solidarity, and even if you can always find some interest behind, which is we have very good colleagues in the UK, and we don't want to lose the cooperation we have with them because of the Brexit, because we cannot imagine that all the UK people will come to other parts of Europe. That's not something that you can imagine. So how can we sustain the relationships? And I think that's part also of what is going on right now, which is part of your solidarity. Nevertheless, I really hope that we won't have in the few years in front of us what we observe from Italy right now. I don't know how it is in the UK, but in France we have a lot of young, excellent Italian colleagues applying for positions in France because they don't have any future in their own country. And that could be a dynamic also for the UK in the future, if we can see that many young people would prefer applying in other countries than in the UK because of the Brexit, and that would be a terrible scenario. And I'm afraid that again solidarity will not play so much a role. I regret to see that young Italian academics are coming and are leaving Italy. But what am I doing as a vice president for research? I recruit them. I don't tell them, just go and just stay in your country. So the solidarity is very fragile, I would say, at all levels, individual, institutional, national levels. And that's very frightening. I'm sorry to stop with a pessimistic view, but I think that's, unfortunately.
Well, it's probably no different than the general co-opetition issue that even institutions themselves deal with. There is ultimately, again, I think Marek referred to it as an absorptive capacity issue. Because even with the issue of the UK dominating, let's say, on the management of projects, the rest of Europe needs to build up a capacity to manage. Certainly even on an Irish scale of a small, I mean, yes, we would like to be attractive, but we have limitations on how many. So are we enhancing an international, increasing the international mobility to other regions and areas of the world that will be more able to take on and absorb students? I mean, we've got a growth in, let's say, Asia in terms of growing their own capacity and being increasingly attractive. And those are increasingly sets of, another set of dynamics. So the dynamics are within Europe, and they're also wider scale, where people might have gone to the US, but now
decide not to.
Not likely to go there either.
I agree that co-petition is a very nice concept and something very interesting, but I think that, first of all, it works on elective affinities. I'm not sure about the translation, just meaning that you cooperate with people who are you alike, so that's very elitist in a way. And second, it works until you feel that defection is better than cooperation. And I think that what we see right now, and that's something I'm trying to study in my own country, where they try to regroup institutions together because they are locally at the same place. And I tell them, if you want to run, if you think you can run quicker than the other, you cannot keep the cooperation. And that's part of what is going on right now, that people realize that they could, or at least some institutions or some countries realize that they could run quicker than the other. And so defection is then the choice. And that's part of the problem with competition. It's very fragile too.
Just quickly, to be clear, because maybe the tone was a bit sarcastic, I think that European universities value a lot the collaboration with the UK, and that's why the UK became such a prominent partner for most higher education research systems in Europe. The question is, so that, and there was a lot of frustration with the result. I think that's obvious. But life will go on. And so I think there will be a willingness to keep those networks and that cooperation as long as that it's feasible. So I think that there are two issues there. One is that I think self-interest, and that's because I'm an economist, I tend to be influenced in that regard. I think self-interest will be stronger than altruism, both at the individual but also institutional and at the national level. So you cannot expect that people will go on in terms of goodwill. I think they need to expect some kind of mutual advantage. And the problem is that I don't have hard evidence. I think it's too soon for that. But if the uncertainty persists, and if we don't proactively work in favor of a scenario that is favorable to sustain those networks, I think there'll be a strong erosion of those networks. That was so. In a sense, the fears that we have been expressing here become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because people will tend to act in a much more careful way. And I think that's the real, in a sense, that was the wake-up call that I was trying to put forward.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I didn't get to my question, which you've just led on to, is about basically what is the role that higher education should play? What are the lessons for institutions, for indeed institutional leaders, the academy, and indeed for students? What should everyone be doing? But we can discuss that over our break. Thank you all very much. It's been a good discussion. We could go on. I think there's one. Thanks very much.